The compass was cold in my hand. Not the cold of something left on a shelf for a season, but the deep cold of something that had waited a long time in the dark to be touched again. The kind of cold that settles into brass over decades and does not give itself up easily. I stood in the garage doorway with the fog still on my jacket and the salt still on my face, and I looked down at this small, round thing in my palm, and I could not speak. I knew this compass. I had not seen it in 31 years. I had thought the sea had taken it, the way the sea takes things without apology and without return, and I had grieved for it quietly, the way a man of my generation grieves for things, which is to say alone, at night, with no one watching. Owen stood a few feet away with his hands in the front pocket of his canvas work jacket, watching me the way a man watches another man when he has done something that cannot be undone, and is waiting to understand whether it was right. He said, "Granddad, I kept this safe for you." I did not know what to say to that. I am not sure I have ever known what to say in the moments that matter most. That has always been my particular failing as a man, and perhaps also my particular kind of love. Let me stop here for a second. I am not a man who is accustomed to telling his story to people he cannot see. I spent 78 years on this coast, learning how to be quiet, how to read the water and the weather and the faces of the men I worked with, and I left the talking to others whenever I could manage it. So if you are still with me right now, do me a favor. Tell me down in the comments where you are listening from. What town? What part of the world? If it is late where you are, tell me that too. It helps more than you might think, knowing that somebody is out there in the dark with me while I try to get this right. Leave a like if what I am saying is reaching you. And if you want another one of these tomorrow, subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day. All right, let me get back to it. My name is Walter Mackenzie. I am 78 years old, and I have lived on Pelham Street in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, for nearly the entirety of those years. My house is a cedar-shingled thing that sits above the harbor, with a view I have looked at so many times it has become less like scenery, and more like a part of my own face, something I stopped seeing clearly decades ago, because it was simply always there. The shingles are weathered to a silver gray that matches the water on overcast days. The front step has settled slightly to the left over the years, and I have never fixed it because my wife Margaret said it gave the house character, and I never found a good reason to disagree with her about anything after she was gone. There are photographs on the wall inside, the old kind, black and white mostly, with a few color ones from the 1980s when we finally gave in and bought a camera that did not require you to think too carefully before you pressed the button. There is a wood stove in the kitchen that I start every morning from the 1st of October through the end of May, because the cold comes in from the harbor here, in a way that the walls of this house have never quite learned to refuse. The coffee goes on before 5 in the morning, because I have not slept past 5 since I was young enough to believe sleeping late was something men were allowed to do. I spent 43 years on the water, lobster, mostly, in the season, and whatever else the sea offered in the months between. I knew the bottom of Mahone Bay, the way a man knows the floor of his own house, with his eyes closed, by feel, by the particular sound a boot makes on it. I can still tell you the depth of water in places that have no name on any chart, places that only exist in the memory of the men who worked them and passed the knowledge hand to hand, the way you pass a tool to someone standing next to you. That is how it worked. You learned from the man beside you, and someday the man beside you was young, and you were old, and you passed it along before you forgot that you knew it. I retired 11 years ago when my knees made the argument that I could no longer refuse. I did not go gracefully. A man who has spent his life moving does not stop moving easily, and I found the first 3 years of retirement a particular kind of loneliness that I did not have a name for until a doctor in Bridgewater told me it was grief, and I thought he was wrong. And then I thought about it for another 6 months and decided he was not wrong at all. You grieve the work. You grieve the early mornings and the smell of diesel and brine and the cold so sharp it makes your eyes water, and the particular satisfaction of a full trap hauled up out of the dark water, and the men around you and the boat moving under you, and the sense that what you are doing matters in a plain and uncomplicated way. Margaret had been gone for 9 years by the time I retired. The cancer came for her quickly, which I have decided, after many years of thinking about it, was a mercy for her, even though it was not a mercy for me. She did not suffer as long as she might have, and she left the house the way she had always kept it, which is to say with a sense of order that I have only partially maintained in her absence, and which she would have opinions about if she could see it now. I talk to her still, which is something I do not advertise to my children or to anyone else who might have thoughts about it. But early in the morning, when the wood stove is going and the coffee is on and the harbor is still gray and quiet out the window, I tell her things. Not the big things, the small things. What the weather is doing, what I had for supper, the way the fog came in yesterday, the way it does sometimes, when the Atlantic decides it has had enough of being seen. I have 2 daughters, Patricia, who lives in Halifax and runs an accounting firm that I do not pretend to fully understand, and Diane, who lives in Chester with her husband Robert, who is a decent man and a good father and someone I was slow to like, and now cannot imagine not having in this family. I have 3 grandchildren. The oldest is Owen. Owen Mackenzie is 28 years old. He came back to Lunenburg 14 months ago after several years working as a marine diesel technician in Halifax, which is not so far away in miles, but felt like another world in the way that cities always feel like another world, when you have spent your life in a small harbor town where everybody knows which boat belongs to which family, and has known it since before you were born. He took a position with the shipyard here, maintaining the engines on fishing vessels and charter boats, and he rented the old Hennigar place on Montague Street, which is a 10-minute walk from my house, and which he reaches most mornings before 7, often with 2 cups of coffee from the bakery on King Street, the dark roast, because he knows I am a man of habit. He is a quiet young man. He has his mother's patience, and his grandfather's particular habit of watching before he speaks, which is something I noticed in him when he was still small enough to ride on my shoulders, and which has only become more pronounced as he has gotten older. He does not say much at family gatherings. He listens. He files things away. He sits with his coffee and his eyes, and he sees things that other people in the room are too busy talking to notice. This quality has always made me feel that he and I understood each other without needing to say so, which is the finest understanding between 2 people that I know of. I had been out on the water 2 days when the fog came. Not my own boat. I gave that up with the retirement, but a trip I take twice a year with Conrad Hiltz, who is 64 years old and one of the last full-time lobster fishermen of my generation still working actively, and who tolerates my presence on his vessel with a generosity I try not to take for granted. The fog came in thick off the Atlantic in the way it does in Lunenburg in this season, sudden and total, and Conrad made the call that I would have made, which was to turn back and not argue with the sea. We came into the harbor almost a full day early, the wharf gray and quiet under the thick blanket of it, the town above us barely visible, the foghorn going every few minutes with its long, flat note that carries across the water and settles into your chest like a hand pressed there. I walked up from the wharf with my bag on my shoulder and the salt damp on everything I was wearing, and I went around the back of the house the way I always do when I come in from the water, because the back door is closer to the mudroom where the wet gear goes. I noticed the garage door was not fully closed, just a crack of light at the bottom, and I heard something inside. Not a sound of danger, just the particular sound of a person trying to be still. I opened the door. Owen was sitting on the concrete floor between the old lobster traps and the spare net I had not touched in 3 years. He had a canvas backpack open beside him, and a small handheld recorder in his left hand, and a yellowed notebook in his right, and when the light from outside fell across him, he looked up with an expression that I can only describe as a man who has been caught doing something good, and is not quite sure how to explain it. He got to his feet. He closed the garage door behind me. He spoke in a voice that was quieter than his ordinary voice, and then he held the compass out to me. I looked at it for a long time without taking it. It was a small brass compass, the kind that fits in a coat pocket, with a hinged lid that was worn smooth at the hinge from years of being opened and closed by a thumb. My father's thumb first, and then mine. I had carried it on the water for 26 years, and I had lost it, or believed I had lost it, during a particularly rough run in January of 1993, when a wave came over the rail and took several things that day that I never expected to see again. I had mourned it the way you mourn a small thing that carries a large meaning, quietly and for longer than seems reasonable. I took it from his hand. The weight of it was exactly as I remembered, which is the particular truth about objects you loved long ago, that your hand remembers the weight of them, even after your mind has begun to let go. I said, "Where did you find this?" He said, "It is a long story, Granddad, and I want to tell you all of it, but I need to show you the rest first." He reached into the canvas backpack and he began, carefully and one at a time, to lay things on the concrete floor of the garage. Notebooks with covers stained by decades of sea weather, cassette tapes in plastic cases with labels written in several different hands, navigation charts folded and refolded until the creases had become part of the paper, photographs, black and white, small and large, letters in envelopes that had been opened once long ago and then carefully tucked back in, a leather-bound log with a name I recognized on the inside cover that stopped my breath for a moment. He laid them all out on the floor between us. He did not rush. He did not explain. He let me look. The garage smelled of salt and engine grease and old paper, and the particular smell of the cedar shingles when the damp gets into them, which is a smell I have known my whole life, and which means home to me in a way that is beyond any word I have for it. The fog pressed against the small window high up on the north wall. The foghorn sounded once, far out across the harbor. Owen stood with his hands at his sides, and he let me look at everything he had laid out on the floor. And I looked at it, and I did not know yet what I was looking at. And that was all right, because he had clearly been preparing for this for a long time, and a man who has prepared for a long time deserves the chance to tell the thing in his own order. I looked at my grandson across the objects spread between us on the concrete floor of my garage, and I thought about something Margaret used to say. She used to say that the people who love you most are often the ones doing the quietest things, the things you never notice until one morning you notice all at once, and it rearranges something inside your chest that you did not know needed rearranging. She was almost always right about things like that. Before Owen said another word, I asked him inside, not because I needed the warmth, though the fog had been cold on the water and my joints were registering their usual complaints about it. I asked him inside because whatever was coming felt like the kind of thing that ought to happen at a kitchen table with coffee on the stove, the way important things have always happened in this house, in this family, in this part of the world. You bring the important things inside. You put the kettle on. You sit down across from each other and you let the moment have the weight it has earned. I need to stop here for just a second. I have been thinking about the people who are listening to this tonight, and I want to say something to you directly. If you have ever sat across a kitchen table from someone you love and felt the particular weight of a moment you did not fully understand yet, you know exactly what I am talking about. Write to me in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from right now. What city, what town, what state, what country, and if you have ever been given something by someone you love that turned out to mean more than you expected, tell me that too. Those are the stories I want to hear from you. Leave a like if this is reaching you. Subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a story like this here every single day, and some of them are going to reach you at exactly the moment you need them. All right, the kettle is on. Let me keep going. The kitchen of this house on Pelham Street has not changed significantly in the 41 years since Margaret and I moved into it, as young people with more optimism than furniture. The table is the same, a wide pine table I built myself the winter before Patricia was born, from planks I got from a mill up near Mahone Bay that closed a long time ago. The surface carries the evidence of 4 decades of use, the ring stains from cups, the marks left by pens pressed too hard, the particular scar along the near edge where I set down a hot pot directly on the wood one evening in 1987, because I was distracted by something on the radio, and Margaret scolded me with a patience that was more devastating than any raised voice would have been. That scar is still there. I run my thumb across it sometimes when I am sitting alone in the evening. It is a good scar. It has a whole life inside it. Owen set the backpack on the floor beside his chair and wrapped both hands around the mug I gave him, and he looked at the table for a moment, the way he does when he is organizing his thoughts. And then he began. He told me he had been working on something for 14 months, since before he came back to Lunenburg, in fact, since a conversation he had at a family dinner in Halifax, the Christmas before last, when my daughter Patricia had mentioned something in passing about a warehouse down on the waterfront here that was scheduled for renovation by a developer who had bought the property the previous autumn. The warehouse had been used in various capacities over the decades by the fishing industry, storage mostly, tackle and equipment in some years, and administrative records in others, and Patricia had mentioned, without thinking much of it, that some of the old records inside were going to be cleared out. Owen said that when he heard that, something in him would not leave it alone. He told me he had driven down from Halifax on a Saturday in early January, in weather that was not fit for it, and talked his way into the warehouse with a polite persistence that he comes by honestly, because his grandmother could talk her way into or out of almost anything when she set her mind to it. He had spent 2 days in that warehouse before the contractor's people arrived, going through what was there, and what was there was more than he had expected. I want you to understand what this young man found in that warehouse. Not objects of monetary value, not things that would make a historian's eyes go wide or fill a museum case. What he found was the accumulated paper record of ordinary working lives lived on this coast over the span of several generations. Logbooks from fishing boats with names I knew by heart, maintenance records with handwriting I recognized from men I had worked beside, weather logs kept by fellows who marked down the temperature and the wind and the sea state every day for years, because that was what you did. That was how you kept yourself honest about what the water was capable of. Letters written between fishermen in different ports during difficult seasons, photographs of boats and docks and the men standing on them, some of them young in those photographs, in ways that broke something in my chest when I eventually saw them, because I remembered them old, and I had not thought to picture them young. He had found, mixed in among records of boats I did not recognize, a set of notebooks in a hand I would have known anywhere. My wife's hand. Margaret had kept records. I had known this in a general way, the way you know things about a person you have shared your life with for decades, without ever examining them closely. She had been methodical and organized in all things, and she had kept records of the household accounts and the seasons and the movements of boats in a way that I had taken for granted the way you take for granted the reliable things in your life, right up until they are gone. What I had not known was that some of those records had made their way out of this house. She had contributed pages, it turned out, to a community record-keeping effort run out of that warehouse for several years in the 1980s, organized by the Fishermen's Association, and the pages she had contributed had been filed there and had simply never come home. They were descriptions of evenings. That is what I want to tell you. Not accounts, not ledgers. Descriptions of evenings in this house, written in her hand, in the years when I was still on the water. The way the light looked coming in through the harborside window, what the children were doing, what she was cooking, whether the fog was in, what time she expected me home and what time I actually appeared, noted without complaint, because she was not a complaining woman. Small, specific, faithful descriptions of the evenings of our ordinary life, written down because she believed that ordinary life deserved to be written down, and she was right about that the way she was right about almost everything. Owen had found those pages in January, and he had spent 14 months getting ready to show them to me. He had done more than simply rescue them. I understood this gradually over the course of that first conversation at the kitchen table, and then more fully in the days and weeks that followed, as he began to explain the full extent of what he had been quietly doing. He had taken the cassette tapes, which turned out to be recordings of oral histories made in the 1980s and 90s by various community efforts, and he had located a working tape recorder and listened to every one of them, and he had begun the process of having them digitized so that the voices on them would not be lost when the magnetic tape finally gave out, which it does eventually, the way all things give out eventually. He had taken the navigation charts and carefully unfolded them and photographed them and traced the routes marked on them in faded pencil. Routes I recognized. Routes that were the accumulated knowledge of men who spent their lives learning where the bottom was, and where the fish ran, and where the rocks were that would open a hull if you did not respect them. He had, in the 14 months since he came back to Lunenburg, visited 12 retired fishermen across the county, some of them men I knew well and some of them men whose names I knew without knowing them personally, and he had sat with each of them with a recorder and asked them to talk. He told me this the way a man tells you something he is not sure how you will receive it, carefully, watching your face. He said he had been afraid I would think it was strange, a 28-year-old spending his weekends sitting in the kitchens of old men and listening to them talk about boats and weather and the water. I told him that was the least strange thing I had ever heard. I need to stop here and tell you something. I am not a man who cries easily. That is not a boast. It is simply a fact about who I am, shaped by the time I grew up in, and the world I grew up in, where a working man kept his face level and saved his feeling for the private hours. But I sat at that pine table I built the winter before my first daughter was born, and I listened to my grandson tell me what he had done. Quietly, without telling anyone, without asking for thanks, spending his weekends and his evenings rescuing the ordinary records of ordinary lives from a warehouse that was going to become something else. And I felt something in my chest do something I do not have a precise word for. Not breaking. Something more like opening, a hinge working that had been rusted shut for a long time. If you are listening to this tonight and you have a grandchild or a young person in your life who has done something quietly kind for you that you did not know about until it was already done, write to me in the comments. Tell me what town you are in. Tell me what time it is there. Tell me what they did. Leave a like if this is landing on you the way it is landing on me even now as I try to say it. Subscribe if you have not yet. There is a new story here every single day, and every one of them carries something true inside it. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it tonight. You know who I mean. All right, let me keep going. I want to tell you about the town I come from, because a place like Lunenburg does not make sense without being explained, and what Owen did only makes sense if you understand the place he did it in. Lunenburg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is a designation the town received in 1995 for the completeness and authenticity of its British colonial settlement pattern, which is a way of saying that the town looks more or less the way it looked 2.5 centuries ago, and that the people who live in it have been sufficiently determined and sufficiently ornery to keep it that way, despite everything that has tried to change it. The houses on the hillside above the harbor are painted in colors that tourists come from considerable distances to photograph, the yellows and reds and greens and blues of a working waterfront town that never tried to be picturesque and ended up being exactly that. The streets run up the hill from the waterfront in the grid that the original settlers laid out, and the buildings along the waterfront have been repurposed over the years as the fishing industry changed around them. But the bones of the place have not moved. The harbor still smells the way it always smelled. The wharf still rings with the particular sounds of a working port. My family has been in Lunenburg County for 5 generations. My great-great-grandfather came over from Germany with the foreign Protestants in the 1700s, the wave of settlers who were brought here by the British to populate the coast, and who built the town on a hillside above the harbor with the methodical intention of people who had been promised land and intended to make something of it. His name was in the old church records, and also, I found out from Owen during those weeks of conversation, in one of the logbooks recovered from the warehouse, referenced in a notation by a man who had known him, a small and entirely unremarkable detail that nevertheless made me sit very still when Owen showed it to me. My grandfather was a fisherman. My father was a fisherman. I was a fisherman. The sea is not a metaphor in this family. It is a profession and a landscape and a set of skills passed from hand to hand, and a collection of specific knowledge about specific places that exists nowhere except in the people who carry it. And that is precisely what dies when the people die without anyone writing it down. This was what Owen understood, that I had not thought about directly until he made me think about it. He told me at the kitchen table, with the fog still thick outside the window, that he had become afraid, not of anything dramatic, afraid of the particular and ordinary disappearance of things that happens when people die, and no one has gathered what they knew. He had been living in Halifax, working on marine engines, and he had started to feel, without being able to name it clearly at first, that something was slipping. Not any one thing. Many small things, like sand moving under your feet in a slow current. He had come back to Lunenburg, partly because the job was here, and partly because he wanted to be near me, and partly because something in him needed to be near this coast, near the water and the harbor, and the voices of people who had worked it. And what he had done with that feeling was remarkable to me. He had not complained about it. He had not waited for someone else to do something about it. He had driven to Halifax on a January Saturday in bad weather, and talked his way into a warehouse and started picking up the things that were about to disappear. There is a man I have thought about many times over the years, a fisherman named Edward Tanner, who worked out of the wharf here for 40 years, and who died in 2003, a few years after I retired. Edward Tanner knew things about the seafloor of Mahone Bay that I am not certain any living person knows now. He knew where the schools ran in cold years versus warm years. He knew which marks to use to find a bottom that had no name on any chart. He had a system for reading the color of the water that he could not fully explain in words, but could demonstrate in practice with an accuracy that sometimes seemed impossible, until you understood that it was the product of 40 years of paying close attention to the same piece of ocean. I learned some of what he knew from watching him and working near him. I tried to pass on what I could, but the full thing that Edward Tanner knew about the water went with Edward Tanner when he went. Owen did not save Edward Tanner's knowledge. That was already gone before Owen understood what was happening. But Owen found a cassette tape, recorded in 1991, of Edward Tanner talking for 47 minutes about a winter season in 1968 that was unlike any other, about the movements of the fish and the behavior of the sea, and the particular decisions that had to be made in conditions that tested every man on the water that year. Owen played me that tape on a Wednesday evening sitting in this kitchen, and I listened to Edward Tanner's voice come out of a small speaker for 47 minutes, a voice I had not heard in 20 years, talking about things I had been there for and things I had not, and I understood by the end of it that Owen had given me something I could not have bought or found or made for myself. He had given me back a voice I thought the years had taken. The garage still smelled of salt and old paper and cedar when I walked past it the following morning, and I did not go inside. I was not ready to go inside. There is a particular kind of readiness that is not about courage. It is about the body, knowing when it can bear the weight of a thing. And my body was telling me that one more morning with the coffee and the harbor and the fog, lifting slowly off the water was what I needed before I sat down with those notebooks and those cassette tapes and everything else Owen had laid out on the concrete floor the night before. A man my age has learned to respect that signal. He has learned it the hard way, through the times he did not respect it and paid for the stubbornness later. So I made the coffee. I started the wood stove. I stood at the harborside window the way I have stood at that window 10,000 mornings, watching the light come in from the Atlantic in its slow, particular way, the gray softening first at the horizon and then spreading gradually inland the way a tide moves, covering everything it touches with a different quality of air. The foghorn had gone quiet overnight. The harbor was calm. A pair of oyster catchers worked the exposed mud at the waterline below the wharf, moving with the quick, certain purposefulness of birds that have no patience for standing still. Owen had gone home at 10:15 the previous evening. He had offered to stay, and I had told him to go home and sleep, because he had a shift at the shipyard by 7 and I was not a man who needed company to think. He had gathered the notebooks and the tapes and the photographs and everything else, and packed them carefully back into the canvas backpack, and he had set the backpack on the kitchen counter where I would see it, which was the right thing to do, the kind of instinct that tells you more about a person than 100 deliberate choices. He had put the brass compass on top of the pack, just set it there on the canvas, the hinged lid up, as if it were watching over everything inside it. I had looked at that compass for a long time before I went to bed. I did not touch it. I just looked at it in the kitchen light and tried to hold both things in my mind at once. The man I had been when I lost it, not young exactly, 57 years old and still on the water and still carrying the weight of a whole, working life in my hands, and the man I was now, looking at it across a kitchen counter at nearly 11 at night, with my grandson's careful hands having put it back in my world. Those two men felt very far apart, and somehow the compass was the thing that connected them. I want to stop here for a second and talk to the people who are listening to this from wherever they are in the world tonight. I have been getting your comments over the past weeks and I read every one of them, and I want you to know that. People in Ontario and in Scotland and in Queensland and in North Carolina, and in places I would never have thought to imagine. All of you sending messages about the old people in your lives, the grandparents and the uncles and the neighbors, the ones who kept things quietly and passed them on without ceremony. Those messages mean more to me than I am able to say in plain language. So tonight I want to ask you something specific. Have you ever found an object from your own past that you thought was gone forever, something small, a compass or a photograph or a letter, and felt the particular shock of it coming back to you? Write that in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. Tell me what the object was, if you are comfortable saying. And if this story is reaching you, leave a like. It helps more than you would think. Subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a new one of these here every single day, and some of them are going to reach you at the exact right moment. All right, let me keep going. The morning Owen came back, it was a Thursday. He arrived at 7:30 with the dark roast from the bakery on King Street, which he set on the table while I got down the mugs, and then he sat in the chair across from me and he did not rush. He understood, the way a quiet person understands without being told, that I had spent the previous day with the backpack and the compass and my own thoughts, and that the sequence he had prepared over 14 months needed to be given to me at a pace I could absorb rather than all at once in the first 20 minutes. He is his grandmother's patience wrapped in a younger man's frame, and I have thought this many times without saying it, and I am saying it now because it is the truest thing I know about him. He began with the cassette tapes, not because they were the most important, but because they were the most concrete, the easiest to approach, the thing I could engage with through my ears rather than my hands and eyes alone. He had brought a small digital recorder that he had connected to a portable speaker, because the tapes themselves had already been transferred. He had done the work of digitizing them months ago with equipment he borrowed from a man at the Lunenburg Academy, who teaches music, and who had the patience to help Owen understand the process. The quality of the recordings varied. Some of them were clear enough that I could hear the room around the voice, the faint sound of a clock or a television in the background, or the particular acoustic of a kitchen that has low ceilings. Others were muffled and required concentration. But the voices were there. That was what mattered. The voices had survived. The first one Owen played me that morning was a man named Fenwick Kraus. Fenwick had fished out of Lunenburg for 38 years, starting as a header boy at 16 and working his way up to his own vessel by the time he was 30, a 42-foot Cape Islander he named after his wife, which is either a deeply romantic gesture or a complicated one depending on your perspective, and which Fenwick always maintained was simply practical because he figured he would spend as much time on her as he did at home, and she might as well get the credit. Fenwick died in 2011. His voice on that tape was younger than his death, probably recorded in the late 1990s, a period when he would have been in his early 60s, and the voice had the particular quality of a man who has spent his life outdoors, deeper than you expect, with a cadence shaped by weather and salt and the rhythms of the sea. He talked for 31 minutes about a specific week in February of 1979, when a storm came up fast enough that several boats were caught without enough sea room to run for shelter. I was on the water during that week, not with Fenwick. We ran different grounds, but I knew the storm. Every fisherman who was working this coast in February of '79 knew that storm the way you know the scar from a cut that nearly went badly, and listening to Fenwick describe it from his position, from the specific place on the water he had been, was like hearing a story I thought I knew from the other side. He described things I had not seen, the way the swell was running from the northwest when it had started in the southeast, which told you the storm was large enough to have changed direction as it moved. The particular color the water went in the hours before the worst of it, a green that was too bright. The kind of bright that you learn to distrust because you have seen it before something bad. The sound the rigging made when the wind passed a certain speed. I sat at my kitchen table, and I listened to Fenwick Krause describe February of 1979, and I felt time doing the thing it does when you are old and a voice comes at you from the past. It does not compress or expand exactly. It does something else. It reveals itself as continuous, as if the years between Fenwick alive and Fenwick gone were not a gap, but a distance you could see across if you stood in the right place. And Owen had found the right place. He had built the platform that let me stand in it. We listened to 4 recordings that morning. Fenwick Krause and the February storm, a woman named Bernice Weihnacht, who had kept the books for 3 different fishing operations over a period of 40 years, and whose memory for names and numbers and the particular financial pressures of different seasons was extraordinary, a mind like a filing cabinet, and whose account of the transition years when the groundfish stocks began to collapse in the late 1980s had in it a grief that she had clearly never been able to put down completely, even decades later. A man named Hector Bachman, who had worked as a marine mechanic on the wharves for most of his adult life, and who described the engines of specific boats with an affection that I recognized, and that made me smile despite myself, because a man who has worked with machinery long enough does develop a tenderness toward the machines he has kept alive, and Hector had it in full, and a recording I was not prepared for. The 4th tape was my father. Owen did not warn me. I understand why he did not. There is no way to prepare a person for something like that. He pressed play, and his grandfather's voice came out of the small speaker, and I set down my coffee mug and I put both hands flat on the pine table, and I sat with that for a moment that I cannot tell you the length of, because I lost track of measuring it. My father, Douglas Mackenzie, was born in 1924 and died in 1991 at the age of 67, which felt young to me then and feels younger every year that I put more distance between his death and my own age. He had fished this coast for 45 years. He had a particular way of speaking that combined the cadences of the old Lunenburg German settlement with a lifetime of English, and a certain bluntness that I spent my whole childhood believing was simply the way men spoke, and only understood in middle age was his specific self, his character, not the default of the region. He had large hands and a specific laugh, and a habit of pausing before he answered any question of significance, as if he were consulting something internal before he committed to a response. His voice on that tape sounded exactly like him. I cannot explain why this should be remarkable, because of course it did. It was him. But when you have not heard a person's voice in 34 years, the accuracy of it hits you differently than you expect. You have kept a version of the voice in memory, a composite, an averaged approximation, and then the actual voice arrives, and it is more specific than the memory, more particular, more precisely him than the general picture you have been carrying. There is a moment of correction, of revision. This is who he actually was. not the assembled impression, but the specific man. He talked about the boats. He talked about the harbor as it had been when he was young, the early 1940s, the war years, when fishing had a different quality to it, when you understood viscerally that feeding people was not a commercial enterprise, but something closer to a duty. He talked about his own father, my grandfather, who I knew only from photographs and one or two stories, and who Douglas described with a son's mixture of respect and old frustration and eventual recognition of the man's virtues. He talked about the winter fishery and the summer fishery, and the changes he had seen in between, the way the boats had changed, the gear, the technology, the men who came and went, and the ones who stayed. And then, near the end of the recording, he talked about me. He did not use my name. He said my boy. He was talking about teaching me to read the tides. A specific afternoon he remembered on the outer wharf when I was perhaps 8 years old, and he was showing me how the water moved around the pilings and what the movement told you about where you were in the tidal cycle. He described the lesson in the straightforward way he described everything, without sentiment on the surface, but underneath it was the particular shape of a man remembering something that had mattered to him. The way I had listened, the questions I had asked, the moment he said I suddenly seemed to understand, and the expression that came across my face when I did. I am not going to tell you that I did not cry. I am going to tell you that I did, and that Owen sat across the table from me and did not say anything, which was exactly right, because there was nothing to say, and he understood that. Here is what I want you to hear from me tonight. I am 78 years old. I have lived on this coast my entire life. I have fished these waters, raised a family in this house, buried a wife I loved more than I have words for, and grown old in the particular way that this town and this work and this sea have made me old. I thought I knew what I carried. I thought I had a full accounting of the life behind me, and what Owen had done, with his 14 months of quiet work and his borrowed tape recorder and his patient visits to old men's kitchens, was to show me that the accounting was richer and more complete and more deeply woven than I had known, that the people who shaped me had left records I had not been able to hear until my grandson retrieved them from the edge of disappearing. That is a gift that does not have a category. It is not a birthday present, or a Christmas present, or something you can measure in any of the ordinary terms. It is something else. It is a young person saying to an old one, "Your life matters. The people who made you matter. And I am not willing to let the evidence of that vanish just because a warehouse needed clearing. I need you to stop me here. Tell me something in the comments tonight. Tell me about a person who shaped you, a grandparent, an uncle, a neighbor, someone older who handed you something essential, a skill or a phrase or an understanding that you still carry. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me the person's name if you want to. And if this is moving something in you tonight, please leave a like and subscribe, because we put out something new every single day, and some of those days the story is going to be exactly the one you needed. Share this one if you know someone who is older and feels unremembered. That share costs you a second and might mean everything to them. All right, there is more I need to tell you. The notebooks took longer, not because Owen made me go slowly, but because I could not go any other way. He spread them on the kitchen table one afternoon the following week, after we had moved through the tapes and the photographs, and he sat beside me rather than across from me, which was another right instinct, because what we were about to do did not feel like a conversation between two people facing each other, but like two people looking at the same thing together. There were 11 notebooks in total. They varied in age and condition. Some had covers so stiffened by salt air and time that opening them required care. Others had held their shape better, stored in a drier part of the warehouse perhaps, and opened with only the normal resistance of old binding. The handwriting inside was not all the same. These were not all one person's notebooks. They were a collection, assembled from various sources over the years of the warehouse's use, and they represented several different hands and several different purposes. 3 of them were logbooks from fishing vessels. One was a boat I had worked on briefly as a young man, before I had my own vessel, a 50-footer out of Lunenburg with a history going back to the 1930s. The log was from the period before I was part of the crew, from the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the handwriting in it was the captain's, a man named Reinhold Hatt, who had died before I was old enough to know him, but whose name I had heard from older men throughout my career as a shorthand for a certain kind of competence and seamanship. Reading his entries was like reading a very compressed and practical poetry, the daily record of wind and sea state and position and catch, written in the abbreviated language of a man who had not much time for writing, and who nonetheless brought to it a precision that told you everything about his character. Wind, NNW 15 to 20, bar falling, ran to the southeast grounds, 43 lobster, lost 1 pot to the chafe. His economy of language made the moments of expansion significant. October the 14th, 1961, hard blow from the north, seas running high, all men safe and all gear aboard. That last line, all men safe and all gear aboard, written in slightly larger letters than the rest, told you what that day had cost them. 2 of the notebooks were something different. They were not official logs. They were personal. The kind of notebooks a person keeps for themselves, not for a record that others might need, but for the private purpose of making sense of days that would otherwise pass without leaving a mark. The handwriting in these was more hurried, less careful, the writing of someone at the end of an evening rather than in the middle of a professional task. And one of them was Margaret's. I knew her hand immediately. You know the handwriting of the people you love, the way you know their voices, by feel, before the conscious mind has finished processing it. Her letters had a particular quality, slightly backward leaning, the lowercase g formed in a specific way that I could not describe to you, but would recognize in an instant. She had always written clearly, always been careful to be readable, but in this notebook the clarity was relaxed in a way that her more formal writing was not, and it told me that she had written it for herself, without the discipline she brought to anything she thought another person might read. The entries were not dated consistently. Some had the month and day, but not the year. Others had a day of the week. Others had nothing, just the entry itself beginning mid-thought, as if she had already been composing it in her head for a while before she picked up the pen. They were, as I had known from what Owen told me, descriptions of evenings, but knowing that in the abstract was different from holding the notebook in my hands and reading them. The first one I read began with a description of the light in this kitchen in what I believe was late October, based on what she said about the angle of the sun coming through the harbor side window. She described it as going gold at the edges, the way light does in the Atlantic autumn, when the low angle catches the water and throws it back at the land, with a warmth it has not actually earned, because the air itself is cold. She described Patricia doing homework at this table. She described the smell of something she had in the oven, a particular kind of apple cake she made with cardamom and brown sugar, and which I have not tasted since she left, because I never learned the recipe and I was never brave enough to ask someone to teach me. She described looking out the window toward the harbor and calculating where I would be on the water at that hour, based on the conditions and the tides, and the knowledge she had accumulated of how I worked, the kind of knowledge a fisherman's wife builds over years of reading weather and learning to translate it into guesses about where her husband is and when he is likely to come home. She wrote that she had told herself she would worry less this season. She wrote that she had said the same thing every season for going on 30 years, and that it had never taken hold, the worrying, that it was simply part of the arrangement, and she had made her peace with it, not by worrying less, but by worrying quietly, so that the children would not see it, and begin to carry it themselves. She wrote that when she heard the truck in the drive, she felt something release in her chest, something she had been holding all day without quite knowing she was holding it. I sat with that notebook for a long time. Owen brought me more coffee without being asked, and sat at the far end of the table and read something on his phone and did not speak, which was exactly what I needed. I sat with Margaret's description of an evening in this kitchen, an evening I had been on the water for, an evening I had not known was being witnessed in this way, and I felt the years collapse the way they had when I heard Fenwick Kraus and my father and Hector Bachman on those tapes. But this was different. This was internal. This was the person who had shared this house and this life and this harbor view with me for 41 years, looking at an ordinary evening and finding it worth recording. There is a question I have thought about many times since then. Why did she write it down? She was not a woman given to explaining herself, and she is not here to explain it. But I think the answer is the same answer that applies to Fenwick, describing the February storm and Reinhold Hatt, writing all men safe and all gear aboard, and Bernice Weihnacht keeping the books for 40 years, with a precision that refused to let the seasons blur together. Some people feel, without theorizing about it, that the ordinary life deserves to be witnessed, that the days that seem small and unremarkable are not actually small and unremarkable, that an evening with the light going gold and a child doing homework and a husband somewhere on the water and a cake in the oven is exactly the kind of evening that disappears without comment if nobody writes it down, and that something important is lost when it disappears. Owen had understood this the same way she had. He had understood it without her, perhaps from her, through whatever inheritance passes through a family that is not genes or money or property, but a way of paying attention to the world. Let me come to the weeks that followed the discovery of those notebooks, because there is a sequence of events in those weeks that I want to tell you about, and it begins with a Thursday afternoon in late October, when Owen came to the house after his shift at the shipyard and told me he thought it was time I met some of the people he had visited over the previous year. He had already mentioned them in our conversations at the kitchen table, the 12 retired fishermen and fishing families he had sat with over 14 months, recording their memories, noting their stories, filing their names beside the names in the warehouse documents when they matched. He had built, in a quiet and methodical way that I now recognized as entirely characteristic of him, a kind of informal network of the surviving memory of the Lunenburg fishery. Not all of them knew each other. Some were old enough that they had overlapping careers with my father's generation, rather than my own. Some were women, the wives and daughters and sisters who had kept the operations running, and the books and the families together while the men were on the water. All of them had agreed to Owen's visits. All of them had talked. He had organized something he called, with characteristic understatement, a small get-together, at my house. On a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks away, he had invited 9 of the 12 people he had visited, the ones who were able to travel, and he wanted me to meet them and for them to meet each other, and he wanted to play some of the recordings in a room where the people being honored by those recordings could hear them alongside the people who had been recorded. I told him he had done enough. He told me he had not done nearly enough, and that this was just the beginning. And he said it with a certainty that I recognized as a young person's refusal to accept the limits an older person has grown accustomed to, and which I decided, after thinking about it for about 30 seconds, was one of the finest things about him. The Sunday gathering was not a large or formal event. 9 people in a room is not a crowd, but what happened in that room was something I did not have the equipment to predict, and have been trying to find adequate language for ever since. These were people who had, most of them, known of each other without knowing each other well, connected by the loose and complicated web of a small working town and a shared industry across several generations. They came into my kitchen and sat around the extended table and the extra chairs Owen had borrowed from the church hall, and they ate the sandwiches and the baked things that 2 of the women had insisted on bringing, and they listened to Owen explain, briefly and without ceremony, what he had found and what he had been trying to do, and then he played the recordings. I watched the faces of those 9 people while they listened to voices from the past. I watched a woman in her mid-70s hear her late husband's voice come out of a small speaker, describing a summer season they had both lived through, and I watched her go very still, and then very slowly put her hand over her mouth, not to stop herself from speaking, but as if to hold something in. I watched a man of 81, a retired fisherman named Chester Morash, who had worked this harbor since before I was born, hear a recording of his own voice from 30 years earlier, younger and fuller, and sit with his hands on his knees and look at the middle distance with an expression that was not sadness, but something older than sadness, something that takes a lifetime to build. I watched Owen move quietly around the room, making sure everyone had what they needed, refilling cups, adjusting the speaker volume, answering questions softly when they were asked. And I thought about what it means to be 28 years old and to have made something like this happen. The conversation that began after the recording stopped did not end for 4 hours. These were not people who had been waiting for permission to talk. They had stories in them that had been waiting for context, for the right room, for the sense that someone thought the stories were worth telling. They argued gently about dates and details. They corrected each other. They reminded each other of names they had forgotten and were startled to remember. They described things I had never heard described. They moved through decades and boats and seasons and the specific geography of grounds that only the people who had worked them knew how to name. And Owen sat among them with his recorder running, adding to the archive in real time, which was exactly the right thing to do. It was during that afternoon, watching those 9 people talk across my kitchen table, that I understood what Owen had actually built. Not just an archive, not just a collection of old recordings and rescued notebooks. He had built a space where people who had lived the same history could recognize each other inside it, where the record of ordinary working lives could be witnessed by the people who had lived them before those people were gone, and the witnessing became impossible. He had done this the way his grandmother wrote in her private notebook, not because anyone asked him to, but because something in him recognized that the ordinary deserved to be preserved and was willing to do the patient, unglamorous concrete work of preserving it. I'm going to tell you now about the garage, not what it was, what it became, and I want you to stay with me for this part, because this is where the story turns into something I did not see coming, and which is the thing I most want you to hear. It started with Chester Marash, which I should have expected, because Chester had never in his life let a good idea sit quietly when there was something to be done about it. He telephoned me on the Monday after the gathering, and he said, "Walter, that room you have in the back, the garage, I want to talk to you about that room." And I said, "Chester, it is a garage. It has fishing gear in it, and a workbench and a concrete floor." And Chester said, "I know what it is. I am asking you what it could be." Chester was 81 years old and had the particular energy of an old man who has decided that the time for waiting has passed. He had been a fisherman and then, in his retirement, a volunteer with the local Heritage Society, the kind of institution that does significant work with very little money and very little recognition, and which depends entirely on people like Chester, who simply show up and keep showing up. He had been thinking, since Sunday, about the recordings and the notebooks and the photographs Owen had rescued, and he had been thinking about all the other material that existed across the county in basements and attics and garden sheds, items that had not ended up in a warehouse and were therefore not subject to the accident of a renovation, prompting a young man to come looking. He had been thinking about what happens when the last person who knows the name of a boat, or the location of a particular ground, or the sequence of events in a particular season is gone, and whether that had to happen the way it was happening, quietly and without prevention. He came on the Wednesday, and Owen came too because Chester had telephoned him as well, and the 3 of us stood in the garage among the lobster traps and the spare net and the workbench and the old tackle I had not touched in years, and Chester walked around the space with the slow assessment of a man who has spent his life understanding what a space can be made to do. And he said, "We can put shelving along this wall and a long table here, and if you get a proper light in that corner it will be bright enough to work by." And I looked at the space I had walked past for 20 years and seen as simply what it was, a garage, a storage place, a room for things I had not yet decided to throw away, and I tried to see what Chester was seeing. Owen was already nodding. Of course he was. He had already imagined it. I understood that in that moment. The canvas backpack and the careful restoration work and the gathering on Sunday had all been, among other things, a demonstration, a showing of what was possible in small and patient increments. And now Chester was standing in my garage pointing to walls and describing shelves, and Owen was nodding, and I was 78 years old and standing in the room where my grandson had been sitting on the concrete floor between the lobster traps when I came home early from the water, and I looked at the brass compass in my jacket pocket, which I had taken to carrying again, and I thought about what Margaret had written about ordinary evenings deserving to be witnessed, and I said, "Chester, tell me what we need. I need to stop here and tell you something directly. What I am about to describe did not happen, because extraordinary people decided to do an extraordinary thing. It happened because ordinary people decided to do an ordinary thing, which was to take a room that was available and fill it with the work that needed to be done. If you are listening to this tonight and you feel that the history of your own community or your own family is slipping away, that the people who carry it are old and the record is thin and the time is short, I want you to hear this clearly. The gap between what is being lost and what could be saved is not a grand institutional problem. It is a kitchen table problem. It is a garage problem. It is the problem of someone deciding to start and someone else deciding to help. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Tell me whether there is a story in your family or your community that is in danger of disappearing with the last person who carries it. Leave a like if this is reaching you. Subscribe, because we put out something new here every single day. And if someone in your life is doing the quiet work of remembering, share this with them. They deserve to know they are not alone in it. All right, let me keep going. The renovation of the garage, if you can call it that, took place over 4 weekends in November. Owen did the structural work, the shelving and the wiring, and the long table he built from reclaimed timber he sourced from a mill up the road that had a lot of salvaged material from old maritime buildings. Chester organized a small group of volunteers from the Heritage Society, people with skills in archival storage and document preservation, who knew things about humidity and light and acid-free materials that Owen and I would not have known to consider. A woman named Paulette Fiener, who had retired from teaching at the Lunenburg Academy after 30 years, and who had more organizational energy than anyone I had ever met, despite being in her late 60s, came on 2 of the 4 Saturdays and imposed a system of labeling and categorization that transformed the rows of Owen's rescued material from a collection into something you could actually navigate. By the end of November, the garage had a long wooden table with good light above it, 3 walls of proper shelving fitted with acid-free boxes and folders, a record player that Chester donated from his own house for the records that had turned up among the warehouse material, alongside the cassette tapes, a monitor, and a hard drive where the digitized recordings were stored and accessible, and a sign above the door on the interior wall that Owen had made himself, a piece of cedar plank with the words routed into it that said, simply, "The Lunenburg Community Maritime Archive." No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, no announcement in the paper, though the paper eventually did a small piece about it, about 3 months later, which brought in several more people with material to donate. Just a room that had been made ready, with shelves and light and a system, open to anyone who had something to contribute or something to learn. The first person who was not already part of our group to come and contribute was a woman in her early 70s named Carolyn Zwicker, who had heard about the archive from Chester and who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in December with a cardboard box containing 30 years of her late father's weather logs. Her father had kept a weather station on his property east of town for the entirety of his adult life, recording temperature and barometric pressure and wind direction and precipitation every single day from 1954 until his death in 1989, and Carolyn had kept the boxes of logs in her basement for decades without knowing what to do with them, feeling that they were too significant to throw away and not knowing who to give them to. She set the box on the long table and looked around the garage, which by then had the particular feeling that purposeful rooms develop when they are being used for the right things, a quality of serious quiet, and she said, "He would have liked this." That was all. He would have liked this. I want to tell you what it felt like to sit in that room through December and into the new year as people came with their contributions, and Owen and his volunteers worked at the table, digitizing and cataloging, and Chester circulated among the contributors with the ease of a man who has been building community connections his whole life. I will tell you that it felt like nothing I had a prior experience of. Not quite like the boat, though there was something of the purposeful labor of the boat in it. Not quite like family, though many of the people who came through that door became something close to that over time. It felt, as precisely as I can name it, like the fulfillment of an obligation I had not known I was carrying until someone showed me it existed. The fishermen and fishing families of this coast kept the records they kept because the sea demanded accuracy. You did not misremember where the rocks were. You did not approximate the tidal current. You wrote down what was true because a failure of truth on the water had consequences that were permanent. That habit of accuracy, that culture of record, had produced over generations an enormous body of material, notebooks and logs and charts and letters and photographs that described the working life of this coast in a level of detail that no official history had ever attempted, and almost all of it was in private hands or basements, or the kinds of institutional storage that eventually gets cleared when the institution changes its purpose. It was disappearing slowly and steadily, the way coastlines change, without drama, one season at a time. Owen had stopped one corner of that disappearance, and now, in the garage on Pelham Street, we were trying to hold a little more of it in place. There was an afternoon in February, about 4 months after the gathering in the kitchen, when I sat alone at the long table in the archive after everyone else had gone. Owen had been there in the morning and had left for the afternoon shift at the shipyard. Chester had come and gone. The room was quiet. The light was gray outside the small window, the particular gray of a Lunenburg February that is less like winter and more like the world holding its breath between one thing and the next. I had been going through a folder of photographs, black and white prints from what appeared to be the 1950s and 60s, based on the boats and the clothing, trying to identify the locations and the vessels from contextual details the way you would read a navigation chart, looking for fixed points you recognize, so you can establish where the unfamiliar things sit. I was holding a photograph of a group of men on a wharf. There were 8 men in the photograph, and I recognized 3 of them. One of them was my father. He was younger in the photograph than I had any clear memory of him being, early 30s perhaps, and he was laughing at something happening to the left of the frame that the camera had not caught, the kind of laugh that takes over the whole face, the kind you do not perform. I had never seen this photograph. I had never seen this laugh on this face in a photograph, because by the time I was old enough to remember him, he was older and the weight of the years had settled into his expressions, the way it does for working men, and the full-face laugh was something he saved for private moments I was not always present for. I sat with that photograph for a long time, and I thought about Owen sitting on the concrete floor of this same room with a canvas backpack full of rescued material, waiting for me to come home. I thought about the compass in my jacket pocket. I thought about Margaret describing the light coming through the harborside window on an October evening, and I understood, in a way that was quiet and certain and without drama, what inheritance actually is. It is not the things. I was raised, as men of my generation were raised, to believe that what you passed down was the things, the house and the boat and the equipment, the savings if you had any, the named things that could be listed in a document and transferred with a signature. And those things matter. I am not dismissing them. But they are not the inheritance. The inheritance is the record, the evidence that a life was lived and that it mattered, and that it was lived in a particular way by a particular person, in a particular place at a particular time. The photograph of my father laughing on a wharf in his early 30s is more of an inheritance than any object he left me, because the photograph tells me something about who he was before I knew him, before the years had shaped him into the man I recognized. It tells me that the person I knew was continuous with a younger self I never met, and that younger self was full of the kind of unguarded joy that the photograph caught by accident. Owen understood this before I did. That is what young people do sometimes. They see the thing clearly before the older person has worked their way around to looking at it from the right angle. And a grandparent who is paying attention learns that the inheritance can move in both directions. I want to talk to you about the spring, not because everything that happened before the spring was prologue, but because the spring was when the archive became something neither Owen, nor Chester, nor I had quite anticipated, which was a destination. People began coming not only to contribute, but to search. A man from Bridgewater who was researching his family's history in the fishery, and who had found our name through the paper's article, drove up on a Saturday morning in April and spent 3 hours at the long table with the notebooks, and left with several photographs of a boat his grandfather had crewed in the 1940s, and an expression that I recognized because I had worn it myself, the expression of a person who has found something they had not known they were missing. A retired schoolteacher from Mahone Bay, who had been compiling a local history for years, came and spent 2 days with us working through the weather logs and the maintenance records, and told us that the material we had filled gaps in her research that she had believed were permanent. And there was a woman named Sylvie, who was in her mid-40s, who came on a weekday afternoon when the room was quiet, and who told me, a little hesitantly, that her grandfather had fished out of Lunenburg for 30 years and had died 2 years earlier, and that she had been struggling with the feeling that his life was disappearing from the record, that the particular person he had been was becoming general, was becoming simply an old fisherman rather than this specific man, with this specific history and this specific way of doing things. She wanted to know if we had anything connected to him. His name was Gordon Rodenizer, and she said the name with the care that people use when the name belongs to someone important. We had 2 things: a notation in a maintenance log, his name in the list of crew members on a vessel he had worked in the 1970s, and a cassette tape. Owen had recorded Gordon Rodenizer in his own home, not long before his death, in one of the visits Owen had made across the county in the year before coming back to Lunenburg. He had talked for an hour and a half. Owen played the tape for Sylvie in the archive room, and she sat at the long table and listened to her grandfather's voice for an hour and a half. And I sat at the other end of the table, giving her the space and the quiet she needed. And I looked out the small window at the February gray Lunenburg light, and I thought about Chester asking me what the garage could be. This is what it could be: a room where a woman in her mid-40s sits and listens to her grandfather's voice for the first time since he died, and understands, in some way that will take years to fully unpack, that the person she loved is not entirely gone, that the archive holds something of him, that somebody thought to record him before it was too late. I have been thinking about what to say to you tonight as I come toward the end of what I have to tell you. I have been a man of few words for 78 years, and I am aware that this account has run long by my standards, and I am not going to apologize for that because I think the length is honest. A story this size does not fit in fewer words. But I want to bring you to the thing that I have been working toward since I started: the brass compass. Let me tell you about the brass compass. 2 weeks after the archive opened in its complete form, Owen came to the house on a Tuesday morning with the dark roast from the bakery, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he told me the full story of where the compass had been. It had been in the warehouse, not on a shelf or in a box. It had been in a drawer in a wooden desk that had been in the warehouse's back office, and which had accumulated over the decades the small objects that end up in desk drawers, items left by various people who had worked there across the years, without any system or any record of who had left what: a pen, a folding ruler, 2 buttons, a small photograph of an unknown person and an unknown dog, a tide table from 1978, and the compass. Owen had found the compass on his first day in the warehouse, in January, when he was going through the desk before anything else, because a desk with drawers is the first place a methodical person looks when they are trying to understand what a space contains. He had picked up the compass and opened the hinged lid and seen, on the inside of the lid, the small engraving that I had put there myself 40 years ago, the initials DM, followed by my own, WM, my father's initials and mine, because the compass had passed from him to me, and I had wanted the sequence to be visible. He had known instantly what he was holding. He had closed the lid and put it in his jacket pocket, and he had not told me, not for 14 months, because he was not ready. Because the story that surrounded the compass, the full story of what he had found and what he had done with it, was not complete yet. He believed that giving me the compass before the story was complete would be like giving someone a book missing its last chapters. He wanted the whole thing to be in order before he put it back in my hands. I told him he was a strange young man. He said he probably was. I told him I did not mean it as a criticism. He said he knew. I took the compass out of my jacket pocket that morning, and I set it on the table between us, and then I picked it up, and I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular temperature of old brass that has been carried close to a person's body, and I held it out to him across the pine table. He looked at it. He looked at me. I said, "This goes to you now. That is what it is for. That is what it has always been for." He took it from my hand. He held it the way you hold something that has just been given to you, and whose weight you are still measuring. He opened the lid. He looked at the initials, DM and WM. And he understood, without my having to explain it, that those initials were not a record of the past. They were an instruction for the future. I want to close by talking to you directly, the way I have been talking to you throughout this account, because you have stayed with me, and I owe you the clearest version of what I have been trying to say. The fishing community of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, is not unique. It is not special in its vulnerability to the ordinary disappearance of history. Every community in the world is engaged in the same slow loss, every day, as the people who carry the memory of how things were done, and who was there and what it meant grow old and die and take what they know with them. The records are incomplete by nature. The important things are almost always the things nobody thought to write down or preserve, because they seemed too ordinary to bother with. The light in a kitchen window, a man's laugh on a wharf, the way water moves around a piling on an incoming tide, the weather on a specific February day in 1979. These things seem small until the people who hold them are gone, and then they reveal themselves as irreplaceable. Owen knew this before I did. He knew it in the particular way that some young people know things, not from theory, but from an instinct about what matters, an instinct that sometimes skips generations and arrives where it is needed. He spent 14 months doing something that no one asked him to do, and no one would have noticed if he had not done it. And the result is a room in my garage on Pelham Street, where people bring the evidence of their lives and find the evidence of others, and where a woman can sit for an hour and a half and hear the voice of the man she loved. What I want to leave you with tonight is this: the greatest inheritance is not the thing in the drawer. It is not the object or the property or the named item that transfers with a signature. It is the record, the evidence, the cassette tape and the notebook, and the photograph and the navigation chart. It is the ordinary evening written down by someone who believed it was worth writing. It is the compass with 2 sets of initials on the inside of the lid, carrying the sequence of the people it passed through, waiting for the next pair of hands. Owen carries the compass now. When he passes it on, it will carry 3 sets of initials, and whoever receives it will understand that they are part of a sequence that does not begin with them, and will not end with them, and that what they have inherited is not an object, but a responsibility. The responsibility to remember, and to make sure the record survives, and to pass it forward into hands that will do the same. Let me ask you one final thing tonight. If you stayed with me all the way through this story, all the way from the garage and the fog and the cold brass compass to this kitchen table on Pelham Street with the harbor light through the window, then you have given me something I am genuinely grateful for. You have let an old man who is not accustomed to talking say the thing he needed to say, and you have listened to the whole of it. Leave me a word in the comments. Just one word. The word is keeper. Only the people who stayed to the end will understand why that word is the right one. Subscribe if you have not yet. There is a new story here every single day, without exception. Some of them are going to reach you at the exact moment you need them. And share this one if you know someone who is carrying a record that deserves to be saved, or who is doing the quiet work of making sure the ordinary lives of ordinary people do not vanish without a trace. That share takes you a second. What it does on the other end might take much longer to measure. From me to all of you listening from every part of the world tonight, thank you. Take care of each other out there, and keep an eye on the things worth keeping.